I have been the keeper of standing record for 41 years, and in all that time, I have delivered the standing record against a proposed incursion only twice. The first was before the Dravathi Council of Margin, in the third year of my appointment, when the Velhari expansion fleet petitioned to pass through the Oreth designation's outer boundary on a course they described as oblique. Not a penetration, they said, only a grazing transit, a matter of navigational economy. I read the record then, and the fleet commander heard it and withdrew the petition in silence. The second was 9 years later, before the same council, when the Rovathton Consortium claimed salvage rights over the wreckage of the Verath Survey Flotilla and proposed to recover the hulls. I read the record then, and the consortium's representative sat very still for a long time before he, too, withdrew without speaking. This is the third time I have been called to read the record. I want you to understand what I am before I begin. I am not a fleet commander. I am not a tactician. I am not a strategist in any discipline you would recognize as strategic. I hold the rank of keeper, which in the Dravathi hierarchy is a bureaucratic rank, a civil rank, and it was not awarded to me for any quality of courage or judgment in the field. It was awarded to me because I have a precise memory, because I am a careful reader of archival language, and because I am, apparently, the kind of creature who can read very cold things aloud without my voice changing. I tell you this because you should know what kind of authority is speaking to you. The record I hold is not a tactical assessment. It is not a model of human military capability, a threat index calculation, or a projection of force ratios. Those documents exist, and they are maintained by people with different ranks than mine, and they will tell you what they know, which is, I should note, considerably less than they believe they know, because the humans have not provided them with much data to work from. What I hold is simpler and older than those assessments. What I hold is a record of what happened, 3 times, in full detail, with every instrument reading we were able to recover, every communication we received before the communication stopped, every mass signature reading taken before the mass signatures stopped, every entry in the operational logs of every ship in every fleet that entered the Oreth designation and was subsequently not heard from. I want to be careful about that word, subsequently. It implies a temporal relationship that is accurate in its sequence but misleading in its tone. It suggests that the not hearing from happened at some point after the entering, as a consequence that followed, as an effect that came after a cause. That is technically true. What it does not capture is the quality of the transition, the particular character of the silence that followed the entry. I will try to describe that character as accurately as I can. It is the most important thing I have to tell you, and it is the thing that the tactical assessments do not address, because it is not a tactical fact. It is, I suppose, an atmospheric fact, a fact about the nature of a place. But first the record, I will read it in sequence. The Verath Survey Flotilla entered the Oreth designation 112 years ago. It comprised 14 vessels, 3 survey platforms, 6 escort craft, 4 resupply tenders, and 1 command vessel designated the Orvath-Kelm, which carried the flotilla's senior commander, a Dravathi officer of high standing named Tessak Vorath, and a crew of 411. The mission was officially a survey mission, a charting expedition to the outer band of the Oreth designation, which at that time our star charts rendered as unexplored rather than forbidden. The distinction matters. At the time of the Verath Survey Flotilla's departure, the Oreth designation was not yet formally designated as such. It was an uncharted region. There were warnings, oral traditions, border advisories from older species, records in languages we were still only partially translating. But the formal designation had not been made. It was made afterwards. Tessak Vorath's flotilla entered the outer band on the 42nd day of their mission. Until that point, communications had been routine. The flotilla had been transmitting regular navigation logs, crew status reports, scientific observation packages, and what the Orvath-Kelm's communications officer called, in language I have read many times, in a dry operational tone that I find, even now, difficult to process without some effort. Atmospheric data of unusual richness. He used that phrase, unusual richness. He meant that the space they were moving through was not empty in the way uncharted space is usually empty. There were structures, not natural formations. He was careful in his report not to use the word construction, but he used phrases that amounted to the same thing: regular spacing, geometric interval, evidence of deliberate placement. He noted that the structures did not appear to be active in any technological sense he could identify, but that they were present in sufficient density and regularity to suggest design. The communications officer was a Dravathi of the scientific rank, not the military rank, assigned to the flotilla because the mission was classified as a science mission rather than a security operation. His operational tone, that dryness I mentioned, was the professional affect of a scientist doing what scientists do, recording what he observed without interpretation beyond what the observation strictly warranted. He did not write that the structures were alarming. He did not write that the structures were dangerous. He wrote that they displayed regular spacing and geometric interval and evidence of deliberate placement. He was describing them the way a naturalist describes a landscape, precisely, with restraint, with the understanding that interpretation comes later. He intended, as I have said, to file a supplementary observation report at the next window. He was thorough. He had been thorough throughout the mission. His logs from the first 42 days of the transit are among the most detailed and careful operational records in the Keeper's archive from that period. His last transmission arrived 2 hours and 14 minutes after the flotilla crossed what our retrospective mapping now identifies as the inner boundary of the Oreth designation's active zone. It was a routine log entry. It noted the flotilla's position, the current heading, the fuel status of the resupply tenders, and a brief note that the communications officer intended to file a supplementary observation report in the next scheduled transmission window. The next scheduled transmission window was 18 hours later. It did not arrive. We sent a query. No response. We sent a second query on a redundant channel. No response. We waited the full standard lapse period for signal degradation before initiating a formal non-contact protocol. At the end of that period, our border monitoring stations had detected no mass signatures corresponding to the flotilla's exit trajectory from the Oreth designation. We expanded the monitoring arc. We waited the extended lapse period. Nothing emerged. This was the first time. I want you to sit with what I have just described before I go on. 14 ships. The communication stopped. No wreckage emerged. No emergency beacon activated. No vessel returned. No body was recovered. No debris field was detected on any long-range sensor array covering any plausible exit vector from the Oreth designation. The flotilla went in. The flotilla's last transmission was a routine log, and then there was nothing, not a distress signal, not a partial message. Not a degraded carrier wave suggesting a transmission was attempted and failed. Nothing. There are, I am aware, explanations that do not require the conclusion I am asking you to draw. Catastrophic multiple simultaneous system failure. Navigational error resulting in transit into an unmapped gravitational anomaly. Hostile contact with a third party, a species unknown to us at the time, present in the region, capable of destroying 14 vessels without any of them managing to transmit. I have read all of these explanations in the formal inquiry reports. The inquiry board considered each one. They concluded, in careful bureaucratic language, that insufficient data existed to determine cause, and that the Oreth region should be formally reclassified as a restricted designation, pending further assessment. Pending further assessment. That phrase is in the record. I note it for you now because I want you to understand that the people who wrote those words did not believe they were sealing the question. They believed they were deferring it. They expected the further assessment to arrive. The Orath Conservancy Mapping Commission launched the second mission 22 years later. This was not a survey flotilla. By this time, the oral traditions from the border species had been more thoroughly translated, and the consensus interpretation, I want to use that phrase precisely, the consensus interpretation, was that the species we were now calling the Orath held the designation in question as sovereign territory. The Conservancy's position was that surveying sovereign territory without contact was inappropriate, and that the appropriate response to the first mission's loss was not a second survey expedition, but a diplomatic approach. The Orath, however, had not responded to any of the communication attempts that had been directed at their designation in the intervening 22 years. This was interpreted at the time as evidence that they either lacked the technology to receive or were uninterested in communication, and the Conservancy took the position that a diplomatic mission with a clearly non-aggressive profile, no weapons beyond standard emergency equipment, a crew profile weighted toward communication specialists rather than military personnel, a vessel configuration that explicitly avoided any resemblance to a combat ship, would be received as it was intended. The vessel was the Dravathi registered contact-class ship Orvath-San, carrying a crew of 63. Its commander was a veteran diplomat named Kalvath Rasian, who had conducted successful first contact negotiations with 3 other species in her career, and who was, by every account in her record, a careful and patient practitioner of her work. She carried gifts. She carried translation matrices. She carried a formal statement of non-hostile intent in 12 different encoding formats, including 3 that the border species cultural advisors had specifically recommended as likely to be interpretable by the Orath. I have spent time with Kalvath Rasian's personal logs from the transit preceding the entry. She was not a fearful person. The record does not give the impression of someone who doubted herself or who entered the mission with the kind of low-grade dread that the first mission's disappearance might reasonably have produced in a less experienced operator. She was methodical. She reviewed the Varath survey flotilla's records in detail, all 42 days of them, and she noted in her own log the communications officer's observations about the structures, and she observed that this information was consistent with sovereign territory, a species that had constructed things that had shaped the space around them, that had organized the region in ways legible to an observer as organization. She found this, she wrote, encouraging. Signs of deliberate construction were signs of mind. Signs of mind were, in her long experience, the necessary precondition for communication. She was going to communicate with whoever had built those things. She had done it before. She believed she could do it again. The Orvath-San entered the Orath designation on the 19th day of its mission. Its communications were routine until the point of entry. The last transmission from the Orvath-San's communications log was a position report filed by Kalvath Rasian herself. It was not a distress transmission. It was not truncated. It was a complete, routine position report, filed at the standard interval, noting the ship's heading, speed, and the crew's status as nominal. It contained a brief personal note from Rasian. These are permitted in the commander's log, in which she observed that the region they were entering had a quality she described as arranged. She meant the structures. She had read the Varath survey flotilla's reports. She was not surprised to find them. She noted their presence in the same tone she might have used to note an interesting cloud formation, precise, professionally interested, unhurried. No further transmission was received. The Orvath-San did not emerge from the Orath designation. No beacon activated. No debris was detected. No rescue signal was received on any channel on any monitoring station. The Orath Conservancy did not immediately acknowledge that a second mission had been lost. The internal records from that period are not comfortable reading. There was considerable discussion about the possibility of signal interference, about the known difficulty of long-range communication through dense structure fields, about the likelihood that Kalvath Rasian was pursuing her diplomatic mission in the interior of the designation, and would emerge in her own time with a contact established. There was, in the language of those documents, a strong institutional preference for a benign explanation. The Conservancy had sent a diplomat. A diplomat does not fail to return, a diplomat succeeds or fails, and comes back with an account of the failure. Diplomats are recovered. The institutional imagination of the Conservancy was not constructed to hold the alternative. 13 months after the Orvithsan's last transmission, the Orath Conservancy formally acknowledged non-contact status and initiated another inquiry. This inquiry's conclusions were less careful than the first ones. The language was more direct. The board noted that 2 missions had now entered the Orath designation and that neither had returned, and that in neither case had any wreckage, emergency signal, crew remains, or communicative fragment been recovered. The board recommended, in terms that made it clear this was not a recommendation, but an instruction, that no further missions be sent into the Orath designation, and that the designation be formally marked as proscribed space in all navigation charts maintained by member organizations of the Conservancy. The board's instruction was followed. For 40 years. 40 years is a long time in the administrative life of any interstellar organization. Organizations change, personnel change. The individuals who wrote the board's instruction, who understood in their marrow the weight of what they were writing, who had read the communications logs and had sat with the quality of those silences. Those individuals retired or died or moved to other postings, and were replaced by individuals who had read the same documents but had read them as historical records rather than as recent memory. This is not a criticism. It is a description of how institutional knowledge changes character over time. The documents remain. The knowledge they encode remains, but the felt weight of that knowledge, the weight that had lived in the bodies of the people who were present for it, that weight diminishes with each generational remove from the event. There is a word in the old Dravathi administrative tradition for this process. It translates, approximately, as cooling. The documents are still there. The facts are still there. But the heat that made those facts feel true in the way that personal experience feels true, that heat cools over time, and what remains is a record that must be read rather than a memory that is simply known. I have thought about this word often. I think about it when I read the Varath Survey Flotilla's communications officer's logs, that dry scientific tone, the careful imprecision of a man describing things he doesn't yet have categories for, filing his supplementary report in the next window, which did not come. I think about how the people who first read those words must have felt them, and how different it must have been from reading them 60 or 100 years later, when they had become history rather than news. 40 years after the Orath Conservancy's formal proscription, a military planning committee of the Dravathi Outer Margin Defense Directorate began reconsidering the status of the Orath designation. The context was strategic. There had been territorial pressure from the Savathi Reach on the Dravathi's eastern sectors, and one school of thought within the Directorate held that a presence in the Orath designation, not an invasion, not a settlement, a monitoring presence, a relay station, a tripwire positioned deep in the uninhabited space of the designation, would provide a strategic depth buffer that the Directorate's eastern flank currently lacked. The argument was made carefully and with reference to the historical record. The historical record in this framing established that 2 missions had been lost to unknown causes, that the cause had never been definitively determined, and that the proscription had therefore been precautionary rather than evidence-based. A properly equipped military reconnaissance mission with a combat escort, it was argued, was a different proposition from a survey flotilla and a single diplomatic ship. The people who made this argument were not fools. They had read the documents. They understood what had happened. They simply believed that understanding changed the risk calculus, that knowing what to look for and going in prepared was categorically different from going in blind. This argument was approved. The Orath Margin reconnaissance mission comprised 31 vessels. 9 combat-rated escort ships, armed to the standard of the period, 12 reconnaissance and sensor platforms, equipped with instruments significantly more capable than those carried by the Varath survey flotilla a century before, 6 support and resupply vessels, 3 command ships, one of which carried the mission's overall commander, a Dravathi admiral named Kovath Darun, who had an excellent record in the Eastern Theater, and who had been specifically selected for this assignment because his operational record showed careful judgment in conditions of incomplete information. This is noted in the mission briefing documentation. The Directorate was aware that the Orath designation presented conditions of incomplete information, and they wanted someone they trusted to exercise careful judgment. The Admiral's personal log from the transit period prior to entry is instructive reading, though not in the way the Directorate likely intended when they selected him. It is not the log of a man who is frightened. It is not the log of a man who doubts the mission. It is the log of a man who has done his homework, who has read the previous inquiry reports, who has studied the Varath survey flotilla's technical records and the Orvithsan's operational logs, who has briefed his captains thoroughly and developed what he considers to be a robust response protocol for the range of situations his mission might encounter. He was prepared. The Directorate had given him preparation as a tool, and he had used it the way a professional uses tools, systematically, without waste. His entries in the days before entry are those of someone in command of his situation. He had 31 ships. He had 9 vessels armed for engagement. He had seen no sign in the historical record that the previous missions had been met with anything that could be described as organized resistance. He had a plan. Admiral Darun's mission entered the Orath designation on the 16th day of its transit. Its communications were routine until that point. Its last transmission before entry contained a complete operational status report, all 31 vessels accounted for, all systems nominal, all crew positions staffed. The Admiral's personal log entry for that day was brief. It noted the entry point, expressed professional interest in the structure field that the earlier survey had described, and stated his intention to conduct the mission as planned. He added one sentence that is not in the formal log but in the personal log section, which is not typically retained in the official record but which was, in this case, because the inquiry board that reviewed the mission afterward chose to include it. The sentence read, "The structures are very large." That was the last communication from Admiral Kovath Darun or any member of his mission. No emergency beacon, no distress signal, no fragment of carrier wave, no debris field on any sensor array monitoring any exit vector from the Orath designation, no mass signature emergence on any timeline consistent with the mission's proposed return trajectory. 31 vessels, 944 crew members, gone. Not destroyed in any way that produced recoverable evidence, not driven back toward the border, not recorded leaving the designation in any direction. Gone. The inquiry board that reviewed the Orath margin reconnaissance mission was the most thorough of the 3. It had, by that point, 3 sets of records to work from, and the accumulation gave the board's analysis a different character than the previous 2 inquiries. The first inquiry had looked at one lost mission and concluded that the cause was indeterminate. The second had looked at 2 lost missions and recommended proscription. The third looked at 3 lost missions. Across 112 years, 3 different organizational sponsors, 3 different mission profiles, 3 different levels of military capability, and reached a conclusion that I want to read to you in the board's exact language, because I believe the language matters. I am reading now from the 3rd Inquiry Board's summary finding, which is dated 62 years ago, and which has been the governing document of the Dravatha's official position on the Orath designation ever since. The board finds that the 3 missions which have entered the Orath designation since the year of initial contact have, in all 3 cases, failed to return in any form, vessel, crew, communication, material remain, or detectable energy signature that would permit a determination of cause. The board notes that the missions in question ranged in scope from 14 vessels to 31 vessels, in military capability from non-existent to combat-rated escort, and in mission character from survey to diplomatic to military reconnaissance. The board finds that these variations in scope, capability, and character have produced no observable variation in outcome. The board further notes that in all three cases, the cessation of communication occurred without any prior indication of hostile contact, navigational emergency, or equipment failure. In all three cases, the final communication was routine. The board finds that the pattern established by these three events is consistent with the operation of a system, whether natural, artificial, or of a character for which the board has no applicable category, that receives what enters it and does not return what it receives. The board explicitly notes that this characterization does not imply human agency, does not imply hostile intent, and does not imply any quality of response or awareness on the part of the Orath. The board's characterization is structural, not intentional. The Orath designation behaves as a system that receives and does not return. The board recommends immediate formal reclassification of the Orath designation as prohibited space, permanent category, with no provision for future reassessment. The board further recommends that this finding be shared with all organizations maintaining navigation charts in the relevant sectors, and that the oral traditions and border advisories that preceded the Varath survey flotilla's entry, which the board finds were substantially correct in their counsel, be formally integrated into the Dravathi navigation record as historically validated warnings. End of the board's summary finding. I want to remain with one phrase in that finding. The board used the phrase, a system that receives what enters it and does not return what it receives. I have been the keeper of standing record for 41 years. I have read this finding perhaps 300 times. I have read every document in the 3 inquiry records, every communication log, every sensor reading, every operational report, every personal log entry that was retained, every border advisory from the older species that the third board chose to integrate. I have read the translated oral traditions of the Velhari border keepers, who have maintained their own warning traditions about the Orath designation for a very long time, longer than our records, longer than our formal engagement with this region. And I have come, over those 41 years, to believe that the third inquiry board's phrase is the most precise description available. A system that receives what enters it and does not return what it receives. I want you to understand what that phrase excludes. It excludes the possibility of a creature in the human sense, a being that makes decisions, that perceives an intruder, that responds to a threat, that pursues, that reacts. A creature that reacted to the entry of our fleets would have left evidence of its reaction. A creature that decided to destroy the Varath survey flotilla would have produced, in that destruction, some material that escaped the destruction. A creature that pursued Admiral Darun's 31 combat vessels would have been observed pursuing them, or observed at the border in the aftermath. None of this was observed. There was no pursuit. There was no response signal. There was no change in the Orath designation's external behavior before, during, or after any of the 3 incursions. The designation absorbed the missions and continued to be what it was. This is the quality I spoke of at the beginning, the atmospheric fact, the particular character of the silence. The silence is not the silence of a predator waiting. It is not the silence of a hostile force maintaining radio discipline. It is not the silence of a civilization that has decided to ignore us. It is the silence of something that did not change what it was doing, because what we did was within the scope of what it does, and what it does encompasses our arrival and our absence with equal completeness. I think about the structures, the ones described by the Varath survey flotilla's communications officer in that phrase I mentioned, unusual richness. The ones observed by Calveth Rician in the word she chose, arranged. The ones that Admiral Dara noted were very large. 3 independent observers, across more than a century, using different language to describe the same quality. The sense that the space they were moving through was organized, that it had been configured, that it was not passive in the way that uncharted space is passive. What is a structure in space that is very large and regularly arranged, and does not respond to intrusion? What is a system that receives what enters it and does not return what it receives? I do not know the answer. I have 41 years of reading to draw on, and I do not know the answer. I can tell you what the border keepers of the Velhari say in their oral tradition, which is significantly older than our written record of this region. They say that the humans build to last. They say that what the humans build does not require the humans to be present for it to continue doing what it was built to do. They say that the border is not guarded. They say that the border is maintained. There is a distinction in the Velhari tradition between those two states, guarded and maintained, that I find, when I try to translate it precisely, very difficult to carry across into our own conceptual vocabulary. Guarded implies presence, attention, decision. Maintained implies continuation, structure, the ongoing operation of something that was designed to operate. A thing that is guarded can be bypassed if the guard is inattentive, or distracted, or simply not present on a given day. A thing that is maintained does not have those qualities. The Velhari border keepers have another phrase in their tradition that I want to share with you, because it illuminates the distinction in a way that I find clarifying, even though it is not a precise statement about the mechanics of what the Oreth designation does. The phrase, translated as literally as I can manage, is, "They made a record of everything that entered, and the record was not kept by a keeper." I have spent considerable time with that sentence. What I take from it, understanding that I am working several translations removed from the original, is that the processes inside the designation document what they receive, that the intake is systematic and complete, that when the Vareth survey flotilla crossed the inner boundary, something in the designation registered that 14 ships had entered. Not a mind, not a watcher, a record, and the record is not kept by a keeper who can decide to close it or set it aside. The record keeps itself, the way a deep-water current keeps itself, the way a mechanism installed and wound keeps itself until it has done what it was designed to do. I do not cite this as evidence. I cite it as tradition, which is a different category. The Velhari have maintained this tradition for longer than we have kept written records in this region, and the Third Inquiry Board found the tradition to be substantially correct in its counsel. I think that finding is important. Not because tradition is proof, but because a tradition that has survived long enough and has been specific enough about its counsel. Do not enter, the border is maintained, the record keeps itself, and has then been substantially verified by 3 independent observations across a century of inquiry, carries a weight that is not identical to evidence but is not nothing. I think about the structures, the ones described by the Vareth survey flotilla's communications officer in that phrase I mentioned, unusual richness, the ones observed by Calveth Rician in the word she chose, arranged. The ones that Admiral Dara noted were very large. 3 independent observers, across more than a century, using different language to describe the same quality. The sense that the space they were moving through was organized, that it had been configured, that it was not passive in the way that uncharted space is passive. What is a structure in space that is very large and regularly arranged, and does not respond to intrusion? What is a system that receives what enters it and does not return what it receives? I have one more thing to tell you before I give you the complete record. There is a species called the Ethori. They are, I use the present tense deliberately, among the oldest species maintaining active navigation in this part of the galaxy. Their records predate ours by a span I will not pretend to calculate with confidence. They are not frequent participants in Dravathi Council deliberations. They do not often offer information voluntarily. What I know of their records is fragmentary, transmitted through the border keeper traditions of three intermediary species, translated multiple times, and therefore not reliable in its specifics. I cite it as tradition rather than record. The Ithori tradition, as best I can render it, holds that the Oreth designation's present character is not original to the region. The region was, at some point in the Ithori's historical memory, a span that our own species cannot usefully imagine ordinary space, not uninhabited, not proscribed, not maintained in the sense the Velhari border keepers mean. Ordinary. The humans were present. They built. The Ithori tradition records something that I can only translate approximately. They built for the time when they would not be here to tend it themselves. I do not know what that sentence means precisely. I have tried for 41 years to know what it means. The Ithori have not offered clarification, and I have not sought it, because seeking clarification from the Ithori is not a simple undertaking, and because I am not certain that clarification would change what I am saying to you today. The record is the record regardless. What the Ithori tradition adds to the Velhari tradition is a temporal dimension. The Velhari describe the present state, maintained rather than guarded, a record that keeps itself. The Ithori add something about the origin of that state. It was designed. It was not an accident of the designation's nature, not a quality that emerged from some peculiarity of the space itself, not a consequence of processes that no mind ever intended. It was built. Someone considered the question of what would happen in their absence, and they answered it. They built their answer into the structures, into the space, into whatever it is that receives what enters the designation and does not return it. I do not know how long ago this was designed. The Ithori tradition does not specify, or the specification has been lost across the translations. What the Ithori tradition does say, in a phrase that every intermediary who has carried the record has seen fit to preserve, is this: the humans have not been present in that space for longer than many species have been present anywhere, and the space has continued to do what they made it do for every year of that absence. That is the tradition. I cite it as tradition. It is not the record. The record is the three missions. But the traditions and the record describe the same thing: a system, running without a keeper, receiving what enters it, returning nothing. There is one instrument-level note I have not yet read to you. In the 41 years since I became the keeper, there have been 2 unmanned sensor platforms deployed at the outermost edge of the Oreth designation, well outside the inner boundary, identified as the active zone, by a committee of the Outer Margin Science Directorate. They were placed there under the understanding that unmanned instruments at the outer boundary did not constitute an incursion and were therefore not subject to the prohibition. The first instrument operated for 7 years and returned useful data. The data was unremarkable, standard gravitational profile, background radiation consistent with the star density in the region, no traffic emerging from or entering the designation in any direction. It was, in the Science Directorate's assessment, data consistent with a large uninhabited region of space, nothing that required reassessment. In the 7th year, the instrument went silent. The silence was attributed to equipment failure. 7 years of operation in deep space subjects instruments to stresses that accumulate. The Directorate noted the failure and moved the project to archival status. 8 years later, the Directorate replaced the instrument with a second, more sophisticated platform, redundant systems, hardened against the failure modes, believed to have ended the first instrument's operation. The second instrument operated for 4 years. It then went silent. I want to be careful here. I am not telling you that the instruments were taken by the designation. I am telling you that they went silent. The cause of their silence was not determined. Equipment failure is the most parsimonious explanation. I include these events because they are in the record. The Directorate did not replace the second instrument. The project was closed. No record of the closure explains why. You are here today because you have proposed a fourth mission. The proposal I have read is a reconnaissance incursion, smaller than the Orath Margin reconnaissance mission, better equipped in terms of sensor capability, with a specific mandate that includes defined criteria for withdrawal at certain threshold observations. The proposal argues, correctly, that our sensor technology has advanced significantly in the 62 years since the Third Inquiry Board's finding, and that a mission equipped with current instrumentation would be able to gather data at the outer boundary of the active zone that was not available to any of the three previous missions. The proposal argues that this data would materially improve the Dravatha's understanding of the Orath designation's nature. I do not dispute that argument. I want to be very clear about what I am saying because my role here is precise. I am the keeper of standing record. I read the record. The record is 3 missions, 112 years, 904 crew members across the first 2 missions and 944 in the third, and none of them returning in any detectable form. The record does not tell you what to conclude. The record is what happened. What I have not found in the proposal is an account of how your mission differs in the dimension that the Third Inquiry Board identified as the structurally relevant dimension. Not military capability, not sensor technology, not mission profile or crew composition or withdrawal doctrine. The dimension the board identified, the one that did not vary across the first, second, and third missions, despite the variations in every other dimension. The board said, the variations in scope, capability, and character produced no observable variation in outcome. I want to sit with that for a moment. I want you to sit with it. 3 missions, no observable variation in outcome, a survey flotilla with 14 vessels and no weapons, a single diplomatic ship with 63 crew and no weapons, a 31-vessel combat mission with 9 escort ships and armament rated for active engagement, no observable variation in outcome. Your proposal is smaller than the third mission. Your sensors are better. Your withdrawal criteria are more precise. In every measurable dimension, your mission has been thoughtfully designed to differ from its predecessors. In the dimension the board identified, the dimension that produced no observable variation across 3 very different missions, I cannot find in your proposal a description of how you differ. I cannot find it because I do not believe it is there. I do not say this as a judgment on your planning. I say it as an observation about the dimension in question. That dimension is not a dimension of capability or technology or mission design. It is the dimension of entering a space that receives what enters it. You have planned everything about your mission that can be planned. You have not planned, cannot plan, what the designation does with what it receives, because the designation has not varied that behavior in 112 years of observation. There is one more entry in the record that I have not yet read to you. When the Third Inquiry Board completed its work 62 years ago, the board's senior member, a Dravathi elder named Vorith Sinek, who had served on the board as the appointed representative of the Office of the Keeper, made a procedural note that was attached to the formal finding. It was a brief note. It was not a modification of the finding. It was an administrative action taken within his authority as the Keeper's representative. The note read, pursuant to the finding of this board, and in accordance with the standing record maintained by the Office of the Keeper, a catalog designation has been assigned to any and all future missions that may be proposed for entry into the Orath designation, as follows. The catalog designation he assigned was the next sequential number in the Dravathi archive of the unrecovered, after the Verath survey flotilla, after the Orvith San, after the Orath Margin reconnaissance mission, the next number. He assigned it 62 years ago. He assigned it before any future mission was proposed. He assigned it because the finding of the board indicated to him, as it indicated to me when I read it, that any future mission, regardless of its design, would require a catalog number in the archive of the unrecovered, and that it was appropriate administrative practice to assign that number in advance of the event, as the inquiry board itself had concluded that the outcome of future entries was not in a category of uncertainty that required waiting for the event to confirm it. I am reading you the record. The record includes that catalog number. The catalog number assigned 62 years ago in advance of the next mission's departure is the number that corresponds to your mission. Your mission has been in the archive of the unrecovered for 62 years. I want to be precise about what this means and what it does not mean. It does not mean that your mission cannot be withdrawn. Catalog numbers in the archive of the unrecovered are administrative designations, not determinations of fate. They can be vacated. If your mission enters the Orath designation and returns, if it crosses back over the inner boundary, and its vessels emerge, and its communications resume, and its crew are present and accounted for, the catalog number will be vacated, and the mission will be entered into the active record as a completed successful reconnaissance. The office of the keeper will update the record. I will update the record myself, or my successor will, and we will be glad to do it. But the catalog number is there. Vorith Senak put it there 62 years ago, and it has not been vacated, because no mission has entered the Orath designation since the Third Inquiry Board made its finding, and no mission has returned from the Orath designation in the history of the record to vacate any of the numbers in the archive. The archive of the unrecovered contains 3 entries: the Verath Survey Flotilla, the Orvith San, the Orath Margin Reconnaissance Mission, and a 4th number assigned 62 years ago that has been waiting. I have read the standing record. I am now closing the record in accordance with the procedure of this chamber. The record is complete. The catalog number is noted. The archive stands as I have described it. If you have questions about the record's content, about the factual substance of any entry, about the precise language of the inquiry boards, about the completeness of the log materials I have cited, I am available to answer those questions. That is the function of the keeper. I am closing the record now. The chamber was very quiet, not the quiet of people holding their breath or of people waiting for someone to speak. It was a different kind of quiet, the kind that settles when the thing that needed to be said has been said, and the room understands that speaking into it would not add to it. I closed the record. I set the archive casing on the surface of the keeper's stand. I noted the time in the operational log of the session, which is my duty to note. I noted that the record had been read in full, that the attending parties had heard it, and that the session was formally closed. I did not look at the fleet commander. I did not need to. I knew, from the quality of the quiet, what I would have seen if I had looked. I have seen it twice before. The stillness that comes over a person when they understand that the question they were about to ask has been answered not by argument but by the weight of a thing that is simply there, that has been there for a long time, that will continue to be there. I gathered my materials and I walked out of the chamber of standing record, and I heard, as I reached the threshold, the fleet commander's chair move, the sound of someone rising, the sound of someone who had decided, in the quiet, that the questions they had brought into the room were not the right questions anymore, or were not questions they wished to pursue. I did not hear the fleet commander speak. The 4th mission was not formally withdrawn that day. Formal withdrawal is a process with its own procedures, its own documentation, its own time requirements. It takes longer than a session of the standing record. But I have been the keeper for 41 years. I know the sound of a mission ending. I know the sound of the moment when the person who proposed it understands that it will not go forward and finds that they do not wish it to. The 4th mission did not proceed. The catalog number remains in the archive of the unrecovered, assigned 62 years ago, waiting. Vorith Senak was a precise man. He was precise in the way that people who read very cold things very carefully sometimes become precise, not because precision is their natural quality, but because the material demands it of them. He assigned the number 62 years ago because the board's finding indicated it would be needed. He has been right for 62 years. I do not expect him to stop being right. I keep the record. The record is what happened. 3 missions in 112 years, each one equipped differently, each one designed with care, each one entering the Oreth designation and not returning. The structures arranged in the space within, the space that receives what enters it, the systems built to last through the absence of their builders, the silence that is not a predator's silence or a hostile force's silence or a civilization's deliberate silence, the silence of something that continues. The humans built for the time when they would not be here to tend it themselves. I think about that sentence when I cannot sleep. I have thought about it for 41 years. I do not know what they anticipated. I do not know what they built for. I do not know, and the record does not tell me, whether they intended the Oreth designation systems to do precisely what they do, or whether what they do is a consequence of what they were built for that the builders did not specifically design. I do not know whether the builders are gone or present or somewhere in between those states, in a way I have no category for. The border species traditions suggest various things, none of them consistent enough to cite as evidence. What I know is that the systems continue. 62 years since the last mission, 112 since the first. The systems continue in exactly the same way they continued then. The structures arranged in unusual richness. The space maintained rather than guarded. The archive of the unrecovered, which does not grow because no one goes in anymore, and does not shrink because no one comes out. I will read the standing record again if I am asked. I hope I am not asked. But if another fleet commander comes to this chamber with another proposal, I will come here and I will open the archive and I will read what is in it, because it is my function and because the record is the record and it says what it says, and what it says is true. I close the session. I said a moment ago that I do not know what they built for, and that is true. But I want to be more precise about the shape of my not knowing because it is a specific shape, and the shape matters. There are 2 ways a system can be built for absence. The first way is precautionary. You build something, you do not know when you will return, you do not want what you built to decay in your absence, so you build it to maintain itself until you come back. The second way is intentional. You build something, you know you will not return, you intend what you built to continue in your absence, and the continuation is the purpose rather than the maintenance. The first kind of system is built for its builder. The second kind of system is built for what it does, independent of its builder's return. I do not know which kind the humans built. The Ithori tradition does not specify. The Velhari tradition does not distinguish between the two. What I can say is that the systems have operated for longer, by any count we have available, than any reasonable expectation of return would sustain. At some point, a point that the Ithori's historical memory may be able to locate, but which our records cannot, the question of whether the humans would return became academic. The systems continued regardless of the answer. A system that continues regardless of the answer to its builder's return is not a system built for its builder. It is something else. It is a thing that has become its own reason for continuing, not because it has a mind, not because it made a choice to continue, but because the design that was put into it at the beginning was sufficient, and the design has not exhausted itself, and there is nothing in the space around it that has been sufficient to interrupt it. The Vareth survey flotilla did not interrupt it. The Orveth San did not interrupt it. Admiral Darun's 31 vessels did not interrupt it. This is the core of what the Third Inquiry Board was reaching for with the phrase, a system that receives what enters it and does not return what it receives. They were not merely describing a behavior. They were describing a quality of completeness. The system is complete in itself. It does not have gaps through which things escape or are expelled. It receives and it holds and it continues. I think about what it must have been like to be the communications officer on the Vareth survey flotilla, in the 2 hours and 14 minutes between the flotilla's crossing of the inner boundary and the filing of his last routine log. 2 hours and 14 minutes is not a short period of time. He was observant. His entire record shows someone who noticed things, who registered the texture of the space around him, who used language carefully in order to be precise. He was looking at the structures, which he had described as displaying regular spacing and geometric interval. He had intended to file a supplementary observation report. He was composing it, I imagine, in whatever preliminary form observers of his kind compose supplementary reports, sorting what he had seen, finding the right technical vocabulary, deciding which observations were worth including and which could be left to a later detailed write-up. 2 hours and 14 minutes of this. And then the routine log, filed at the standard interval, including the note about the supplementary report to come. He did not file a distress signal. He did not file a truncated last message with any phrase that suggested urgency. He filed a routine log. This is either because nothing in those 2 hours and 14 minutes gave him reason to file a distress signal, or because the point at which he might have filed one came too quickly for him to do so, or because the system's operation on the flotilla was of a kind that did not produce the physical or mental state that generates a distress signal before it was too late to generate anything. I do not know which of these is true. No one does. The log ends where it ends. But I find myself thinking sometimes about what he saw in those 2 hours and 14 minutes, the structures at unusual richness, very large as Admiral Darun would describe them a century later, regularly spaced, geometrically arranged. He was a scientist. He was interested. He was composing his supplementary report. He was not afraid, or if he was beginning to be, it had not yet reached the threshold at which a professional files a distress signal rather than a routine log. What did he see? What was the quality of those structures at proximity that a scientific observer would describe as requiring a supplementary report rather than an emergency transmission? What was it like to be inside that richness, surrounded by things that were very large and deliberately placed, knowing, somewhere in the trained corner of a scientist's mind, that deliberate placement implies purpose, and that purpose in a system of this scale implies a design that was made to do something? I think about this. I should not, perhaps. It is not productive thinking, and the keeper's function is not to speculate but to record. But 41 years is a long tenure, and the record I keep is specific in what it contains and specific in what it does not contain, and what it does not contain are answers. After 41 years of reading it, the gaps in the record have become as familiar to me as its contents. The communications officer's supplementary report that was never filed. The transmission that Calvath Rician intended to send once she had made contact. The after-action account that Admiral Darun would have written if he had returned. All of these are present in the record as absences, as things that the people who entered the designation had every intention of producing, had planned to produce, had in some cases been composing mentally in the moments before the record ends, and which the record does not contain because they were not produced. An archive of intentions is a strange thing to maintain. It is not what I was trained to maintain. I was trained to maintain a record of events, of communications, of formal findings, of institutional decisions. The archive of intentions is not a formal category. It is what accumulates over 41 years when you read the record carefully enough. The communications officer intended to file his supplementary report. Calvath Rician intended to establish contact. Admiral Darun intended to conduct his mission as planned and return with an assessment that would give the Directorate the strategic depth buffer it needed on its eastern flank. All of these intentions are in the record, in the form of the notes and logs and briefings they produced before their missions entered the designation. And all of these intentions are also in the record, in the form of their absence after the missions entered. The system received the intentions along with everything else. The system does not distinguish. This is the most precise thing I can say about the nature of the Orath designation, after 41 years of reading its record. The system does not distinguish. It does not assess what enters and decide what to do with it. It does not recognize a survey flotilla as different from a diplomatic mission, as different from a combat fleet. It does not register the intentions of the crews who enter it, the careful scientist composing his report, the patient diplomat planning her negotiation, the experienced admiral executing his mission as planned. It does not register any of it. It receives, and it holds, and it continues, and whatever it receives becomes part of what it holds. The border keepers of the Velhari have a tradition about this too, one I have not yet cited, because I was not certain I could translate it in a way that preserved its meaning. But I want to try, because it is the tradition that I find most clarifying, and I think you should hear it. The tradition holds that the humans, when they design their systems, design them without exceptions. Not because they could not conceive of exceptions. The Ithori tradition implies the opposite, that the humans were a species of considerable conceptual sophistication, that their design work was deliberate and thoughtful, and carried out with full awareness of what they were creating. But they chose not to build exceptions into the system. The Velhari tradition's explanation for this choice is, again, difficult to translate precisely, but the approximation I have arrived at after many years of working with the source material is this. They decided that a system with exceptions is a system that can be argued with. A system that can be argued with is a system that can be defeated by the right argument. And if the purpose of the system was to ensure that the designation was maintained through their absence, maintained without a keeper, without a mind to make decisions about who should be allowed in and who should not, then building in the capacity for argument would defeat the purpose. The system would have to be able to say no to some things and yes to others, and saying yes to some things means there is a category of things the system lets through. And a category of things the system lets through means there is an approach that will work. And an approach that will work means the system can be studied, reverse engineered, gamed. And a system that can be gamed is not the kind of system they were trying to build. So they built a system without exceptions. A system without exceptions receives what enters it, without assessment, without discrimination, with equal completeness, regardless of the character or capability or intention of what enters. The Varath survey flotilla entered, the system received it. The Orvathsan entered, the system received it. Admiral Daran's 31 vessels entered, the system received them. All of them with equal completeness, no observable variation in outcome, as the third inquiry board found, because the system was built to produce no variation in outcome, because variation in outcome requires a mind to produce variation, and the system has no mind, and that is not a flaw in the design. That is the design. I have kept this record for 41 years. I have tried in that time to find a way to read it that does not end where it ends. I have read the inquiry board findings looking for the paragraph I missed, the subordinate clause that opens a door. I have read the Velhari tradition looking for the exception to the no exceptions principle, the case in which the system was satisfied and released what it held. I have read the fragmentary Ithori records looking for the moment when the humans returned and switched the system off. I have not found any of these things. They are not there. What is there is what I have read to you today. The record, 3 missions, 112 years, the structures arranged in unusual richness, the final routine transmissions, the silences, the inquiry board's careful language, the archive of the unrecovered with its 3 entries and its 4th number waiting. And the system, which continues, which was built to continue, which has continued through every year of the Dravatha's formal engagement with the Orath designation, and through every year of the Ithori's much longer memory of this region, and through every year before that, during which no species that our records name had any engagement with this region at all, and the system continued regardless. It will continue tomorrow. It will continue when I am no longer the keeper. It will continue after whatever species inherits the navigation charts from the current generation of spacefaring civilizations looks at this region and wonders. It will be patient with their wondering. It will be patient with whatever mission their wondering eventually produces. It will receive what enters it. It will not return what it receives. I close the session.